What are the parameters of the mitzvah of Shemittah? Is it that we may not work the land in Israel, or is that the land in Israel may not be worked? How does it work during Shemittah? Does the farmer have to formally relinquish control over his property? Or is it automatic that his property is open season for everybody else? And how do the laws as they govern the land during Shemittah compare to how the laws governing debts work during Shemittah? Do we relinquish debts? Or is it automatically taken from us? And all of this also links to the spiritual lesson of what Shemittah represents. The Rambam writes about the mitzvah of Shemittah as follows. Mitzvah saseh, there's a positive mitzvah, that we should rest, we should desist from working the land or working trees during the 7th year. Shenema, as the pasuk says, in our parasha, that the land should rest. Ve'nemar, and the pasuk also says that we have to rest specifically from plowing the field and from harvesting the field. So there's this analysis that is a well-known analysis. Is the mitzvah that the land should rest? Which is what it sounds like from our parasha. That's what it sounds like, that the land should have a Shabbos, should have a time of rest. Shabbos and la'aretz, same principle in the pasuk. Shnas Shabbos and la'aretz, same thing, that there should be this year of rest for the land. As the Rambam himself writes, that the mitzvah is that the land should rest from being worked during Shemittah. So that's one possibility, that the mitzvah is the land needs to rest. Or, alternatively, or it could be that the mitzvah is that people don't work the land. Like the other pasuk that says, plowing and harvesting, which are human activities, tishbois, you have to rest. As the Rambam said in the first quotation, that it is a mitzvah for us to rest, to desist from working either the land or trees. So which one is it? Is it a mitzvah for the land to rest, or a mitzvah for us to leave the land alone? So when you get into the details, that there's a specific prohibition against working your field, planting your field, pruning your vine, etc. That's very clear that that's obviously referring to the person. The person may not do those activities, may not work the land. But the question is principally, in concept, is the concept of Shemittah a concept that the land needs to rest, or a concept that we may not work on the land? And that'll have a practical application, or at least one of the nafkaminas. So if we go with the view that the mitzvah of Shemittah is that the land needs to rest, then it makes no difference who works the land, it would be a problem. And therefore, so if I had a piece of land and a non-Jewish person worked my land, so the non-Jewish person is obviously not obligated by mitzvahs. If the requirement is that the land should rest, then I've done an avera by allowing the non-Jewish person to work on my property. Whereas, if the mitzvah is that I'm not allowed to work the land, then I could have a non-Jewish person working in my field on the Shemittah, and there's no problem. So we really need to understand, is it an issue that the land fundamentally has to rest, or is it that we may not work? Now, similarly, so here's another dimension or perspective on the mitzvahs of Shemittah, and a similar kind of analysis. The pasuk says, "Vashvis tishmetenu unetashda," that what happens on Shemittah, besides the fact that we don't work the land, we have to abandon the land, literally retract our hands from the land. So the question is, "Ha'im mitzvah Shemittah saperosi shetzorich balabais lashmit lehafkir masharetz motzir b'shvis," in order to restrict myself from the product of my land, right? So the mitzvah is I'm not allowed to work the land. In addition to that, there's a mitzvah that I'm not allowed to take ownership of the product of my land. So do I have to physically do something or say something to declare it all ownerless, hefker? Kilashon Rambam b'Sefer HaMitzvos, like the Rambam says in Sefer HaMitzvos, shetzivonu lehafkir kol ma shetitzmach, that we have to relinquish ownership over anything that grows. Over Sefer Hayad, or as he says in Mishnah Torah, lahashmit kol ma shetoitzi haaretz b'shvius, that we have to relinquish anything that grows, even if we didn't plant it during Shemittah. So do we have to actively release control over our produce? Or is it as if it's like a royal edict that rips away our ownership over our own produce? Or so is it from a perspective that the Torah neutralized our ownership, like the concept of hefker based in hefker, that the courts have the authority to remove somebody's ownership over their own assets? So maybe that's what happens. The Torah removes our ownership over our assets and we don't have to do anything. Okay, so two questions. Is the the prohibition against working the land that the land has to rest, or that we are not allowed to work the land? And is the prohibition against using the produce that grows during Shemittah that we have to actively relinquish our rights to it, or does it happen automatically by royal edict from Hashem? Now again, we'd see a similar distinction between whichever angle we choose to look at this. So let's say there's a scenario of a farmer who refuses to relinquish ownership over the product of his field. So for example, he puts up a fence, he locks up his field or his vineyard. So now, if the Torah requires the owner of the field to intentionally relinquish ownership, let's say that now the person, obviously they did the wrong thing. They put up a fence around the field, so they're not able to fulfill this mitzvah to let it all go. So in spite of the fact that the owner of the field would have transgressed the requirement to let everything go, if he hasn't done so and somebody else takes that fruit, they're a ganav. Person who would take that fruit without permission from the owner would actually be committing a crime, because in spite of the fact that the owner behaved inappropriately, it's still his produce. So somebody else takes it without permission, that's stealing. And we'll get to the end in a second. But if it's a divine decree, then well, then I can walk into the person's field and take the produce because it's not theirs. They've decided it's not theirs. It doesn't matter how much they scream and protest. It's not theirs. So there are practical differences. And there's another practical difference, very obvious one. The halacha is that any product that grows during Shemittah, grows wildly during Shemittah, you do not give meiser from that produce. Because there are ownerless fruits or grains, so they don't get given to the Levium. So now, if the mitzvah is that the owner has to formally relinquish his rights to that produce, then by virtue of the fact that he refuses to relinquish ownership of this fruit, it obviously still belongs to a person. If it still belongs to a person, it requires meiser. But if what happens is that it's hefker, why? Because there's a Torah decree that whether you like it or not, these fruits and this produce is taken from you. And it doesn't matter if the person hasn't done or said anything that they were supposed to say in order to make it hefker. Who cares? It's not that person's produce, so it's automatically exempt from meisers. Okay, so these are the questions we have to try and work out. Now, Avalef Shalom, it is possible to argue. Let's go to that scenario. The hard-headed individual who says, I don't care that it's Shemittah, I'm not willing to relinquish my rights to my produce. And what do we say about him? That we say, in all likelihood, in spite of the fact that the person doesn't want to relinquish their rights, he shouldn't have to give meiser from the fruit because Hashem overrode his rights. The truth is that you could even say, even according to the view that says, well, he was required to relinquish his authority and he hasn't done so. And I know you're going to think logically that therefore he should have to give meiser. Guess what? He doesn't, for a very simple reason. Because why is it that fruit that belongs to the Shemittah year is exempt from Meiser? Not because in practice it is right now ownerless, and mitzad achiyuv lehafkiram, but because the status of this particular produce is it needs to be ownerless. In other words, let's explain. Let's look at, you've got 6 years in the agricultural cycle and then the 7th year Shemittah. Now, in the 6 years of the agricultural cycle, there are different years when you are required to give different maasros. In the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th years, the person had to separate 10% to use as maaser sheni, which you had to eat back in Yerushalayim. In the 3rd and the 6th year, that same 10%, instead of being maaser sheni, was maaser for the poor. So now, obviously, we don't want a person to have such a burden. Imagine giving away 20% of their yield in a single year, to be too much. So the Torah alternates. Sometimes it's maaser sheni and sometimes it's maaser ani. But let's just say, what happens if the first year goes by and the person does not take maaser sheni? Nobody is going to suggest that olav lo seis maaser ani, that if he doesn't give maaser sheni, he now has to give maaser ani. For a very obvious reason. The produce in the first year of the 6-year cycle has no responsibility to the poor in terms of maaser ani. In other words, we can understand that there are certain yields of the field that are not part of certain obligations. Likewise, let's look at the produce of Shemittah. Because the Torah demands that a person relinquish their ownership of that produce, whether they do it or not doesn't change the fact this produce was intended to be exempt from Meiser, even if in practice the particular owner of this particular field did not choose to relinquish his rights, doesn't matter. It's like the particular guy who didn't take Meiser Sheni. We're not now going to impose Meiser on him because he didn't do Meiser Sheni. He didn't do it. It's his problem. He's got to do tshuva. But the produce doesn't now suddenly become taxed by a different obligation. And it's the same thing over here. The produce should have been hefker, but he didn't make it hefker. We're not now suddenly going to tax him with an obligation to have to give maaser from this produce. Okay, so which one is it? Is it that the individual has to choose to relinquish their fruits from their ownership in order to fulfill the mitzvah? Or does it happen automatically because there's a divine decree? So let's support the second view. Let's go with the second view, that it would seem that this is Hashem in control of the situation and kind of neutralizes our authority over our own produce during the Shemittah year. Where would you get that from? Apparently, let's see if this works. There's a medrash that comments, the pasuk tells us, there are those who are powerful individuals. And why are they powerful? Because they do what Hashem wants and they listen to what Hashem says. Who are those people, says the medrash? They're the people who keep Shemittah. Asks the medrash, why are they called strong people? Think about it. Because the farmer now sees that his field has been made hefker. It's no longer in his control. And his trees are open season for anybody. And the fences are broken. And he sees other people eating his produce that he worked so hard for. And he has self-control and iskafia, and he doesn't say a word. That is what we call Giboyer Koch. Now, look at the words the Medrash used. It sounds like it's been ripped from his control, that his field has been made hefker, like it or not, right? Listen to the language. He sees that his field is made hefker, and his trees are made hefker. Mashma, that implies that it happened outside of his control, not by his choice. And that would seem to indicate that as we thought a possible way to explain it, that it's this overriding heavenly decree. And it's not a factor of his choice. Okay, so there we go. We had a dilemma. The fact that we are not allowed to use our own produce during Shemittah, is it something we have to actively, consciously decide to do, or is it something which is Hashem's decision? But it's not so simple that this medrash is telling us clearly he sees his field is hefker, and that means he couldn't control it. It wasn't up to him. It's a divine decree. Not so simple, because we could explain it a different way. The medrash is describing not what caused this scenario, but what the scenario is. When the person looks out over his field during Shemittah, what does he see? He sees that his field has been left open to anybody, as have his trees. The Medrash didn't get into the details of how it reached that point, whether he had to do something actively or whether it happened automatically. It's possible that the Medrash believes that the person made the official declaration, it's all hefker, or he opened the fences so it should be accessible to everybody. He did what he had to do. And then it's later on when he sees what's going on. Even though he was the one who made this possible, he was the one who opened the gates wide. It's when he sees it happening, that's when it kochs inside of him, similar to the concept that we know that you can never compare the reality of seeing something to just hearing about it. So it is possible that it is not afkato de malka. It is possible that the requirement of Shemittah is that the farmer individually selects or elects to let go of his produce. So let's try and support this side of the argument. Now let's try and support the side of the argument that says that in order to fulfill the mitzvah, to let go of the produce of the field, the person has to consciously do something to declare it hefker. Let's find support for that argument. Let's find some support to this opinion, that the fact that we relinquish ownership of the produce in our fields is not because Hashem just does it for us automatically, like it or not, but rather that we consciously make that decision. We'll prove that it's because we see that there's a link between the concept of letting go of the produce of the field during Shemittah and letting go of debts, which also happens during Shemittah. So this is what the Gemara says. The pasuk tells us this is the detail of Shemittah Shamoit, that you have to let go of debts. Says the Gemara, which stays Shemittah is a kosev medaber. There, by virtue of the fact that the Torah uses the term Shemittah twice in the same sentence, tells you it's actually referring to two kinds of Shemittah. Acha Shemittah's karka. One is letting go of the produce of the field, that it should be hefker for everybody. V'acha Shemittah's ksofim. And the other is letting go of debts and understanding that we write off debt that wasn't repaid before the Shemittah. And from that we learn Bisman Shatam Shamet Karka Chura, at the same time where you have all of the rules of Shemitah's Karka, that's when you have the rules of relinquishing debts. If you go back to the Gemara, you see it's a debate, and this that we've just quoted is the single opinion of Rabbi against the majority opinion of the Rabbanon. The debate is actually only about the last point that Rabbi said, that at the time where you have the Yovel operating in Israel, that's when you also cancel debts during Shemittah. That's what the Rabbanon argue about. But the principal connection between letting go of rights to one's produce and letting go of rights to one's debts, that the Rabbanon acknowledge that that's a real thing. So therefore, if we understand a little bit more about how the cancelling of debts during Shemittah works, it will help us to understand the nature by which we cancel ownership of produce during the course of Shemittah. So let's have a look. What does the Mishnah tell us about cancelling debt? It says the following, and this is where things get really interesting. If a debtor returns a debt after Shemittah, after the debt should have been cancelled or was cancelled, then the creditor should say, I forgive it. I cancel it. It's fine. Shmittah. Says the Mishnah, but if the debtor insists that he still wants to pay, yekabel mimenu, then the creditor can take that money, because the Torah says this unique expression, zeh devar shmita. Devar. It's up to your words. You get to decide whether or not you cancel the shmita or not, whether or not you cancel the debt or not. Now, if the cancelling of debts was a divine decree and therefore what would happen is that it would be automatic that debts would be cancelled, then it wouldn't make sense to have a conversation about the person who still wants to pay and the other person says, yes, but I forgive the debt. And especially when he says, yeah, but I still want to give you the money, and all the commentators say, it's not just that I want to give you the money, I want to pay the debt. You can't pay a debt if the debt has been cancelled by a divine decree. So that lends itself to tell us that it's not an automatic cancellation of all debts when Shmittah occurs. Furthermore, seeing as the Torah tells us that Shmittah completely neutralizes and cancels the debt, then logic would tell you it should be forbidden for a borrower to override the Torah and say, but I'm giving you the money back. To return a debt. How can you return a debt if the Torah said there is no debt? What do you think you have authority to speak over the Torah? The Torah said there is no debt over here. And look what the Mishnah says. Not only does the Mishnah say, yes, it's fine, you can decide to repay the debt, even though it's Shmittah. And the next Mishnah says, that if a person does this, the Chachamim are actually quite pleased with his actions. And he calls them mashma. That makes it pretty clear. It's impossible to suggest that cancelling debts during Shmittah is an automatic divine override of the system that you cannot stop. Because if that were the case, if it were the case that it was automatic, as Shmittah started, the sunset of Rosh Hashanah of that year, all debts would automatically be cancelled, then there'd be no way that the person could come along and say, I'd like to still repay the debt. And the Chachamim would say, wow, shkoyach, we think that's brilliant. Because number one, if it was Chayvas Gavri ala Malva l'Shamitz, so what is it? Number one, we learn that it is the creditor's responsibility to actually, proactively cancel the debt. And even then, he doesn't have to say the debt is cancelled. He just has to withdraw from the debt and say, I'm no longer going to chase it. We're not going to demand it any further. Parenthetically, that will also explain the Rambam's language, where he says, mitzvah saseh lehashmit hamalveh b'shvi shenem achulei. He says that mitzvah is for the lender to retract from the debt. Dvorim sheyesh lemokim bepashtus rak im hashmota yechiv ala malveh. That's something, that language would only work if there's a responsibility of the creditor to let go of the debt on Shmittah. V'lo yafkata demalkot would not work if it was this overriding spiritual principle that occurred, like it or not, because then why would the Rambam say mitzvah say la shmita mal? Okay, so what do we know now? That we have evidence from the story of the cancellation of debts to support the argument that the owner has to relinquish his rights to his produce on the Shmittah year. This will explain more what the Rambam says. If a person comes to the creditor and says, I'd like to give you the money back, what does the creditor have to say? Mashmit ani, I withdraw. Ukfar niftarto mimeni, and you have already been exempt from paying me. And then if the borrower still insists and says, but still I want you to accept this money from me, then you kabel mimenu. Then he can accept it, because the Torah said he may not pressure the borrower to pay him. But he didn't do that. He didn't ask for the money, so there's no reason why he can't accept it. So it's clear from the Rambam, the mitzvah requirement that the malveh has to relinquish his debt is all defined by not chasing the debt, not pressurizing the borrower. So in other words, lo yigois you only think of as what you're not allowed to do. The Rambam's clarifying it's actually part of the definition of what he has to do. What does he have to do? Not chase the money. Or Colossian Achinuch, like the Sefer Achinuch says, La azoiv hachoivos, that the mitzvah is to abandon debt, in other words, not to demand them. And there's even an opinion that says in halacha that if a creditor does not ask for payment, the debtor is not required to pay. So just not asking for payment is already enough. And you see this from the psukim which say Shamoid kol bal mashe yoda asher yashav v'rei'eyu lo yigoyis rei v'sochiv v'asher lechois achicha tashmit yodecha. So you're seeing over here very clearly that the Torah is telling you don't chase him, don't pressure him, withdraw your hand. So now that we know that there are those words in the context of Shemittah, which is don't go chase and pressure the person to pay you back. So therefore we know that the Baal HaChoiv, the person who's owed the money, does not or should not go chase after it. The moment the creditor says, I'm not asking for the money, automatically the borrower is no longer required to pay the money because the one depends on the other. The responsibility of the borrower depends on the insistence of the lender. Again, going back to the Rambam's expression, Mashmit ani, I relinquish, vukvar niftarto mimeni. You are now exempt from paying me. Haloive niftar mishibude lemalve. You are, as the borrower, now no longer required to owe me, the lender, anything. Now here's where it gets very interesting. By this description, all that happens is the relationship between these two people is dissolved. Their relationship was debtor, creditor. Debtor has to make good to the creditor and pay money. Creditor says, you no longer have to do that. That dissolves their relationship. But technically, that bundle of money that is owed technically still carries some responsibility to be repaid. Because the debt wasn't cancelled, the loive's expectation, the malve's expectation, the creditor's expectation was released. Big difference. If it was Afkata the Malk, if the Eibusher said this debt can no longer exist, there would be nothing, no recourse, there'd be no relationship between that money and this creditor. But here we're saying there's no longer a relationship between the debtor and the creditor. The money technically has the spiritual energy of a debt. That's why almost all the poskim, except one, the Yureim, say that that there isn't actually a responsibility for the debtor to return money to the creditor. Even before the malve says, you don't have to pay me. And in spite of that, so it's Shemittah, so there's no responsibility to repay the debt, and yet when he does, it's still considered repaying a debt. How is that possible? Because in spite of the fact that the debtor is no longer considered a debtor, and therefore he doesn't have to give the money back, the principle that there was a debt is still valid. There is still technically a debt. I was singing to put it differently. When he borrowed, at the moment that this person borrowed money from the other person, a segment of his assets belonged partially already to that other person. And repaying the debt is to square that up and say, here's the portion that actually belonged to you. Fascinating, right? Now, some of the commentators on the Mishnah want to say, no, it's just like it's a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah on the individual as a debtor to pay back money, and that's what's happening over here. We can prove that's not the case. The opinion that says that in spite of it being Shemittah, there is still a responsibility for him to return the debt to the malveh, unless the lender clearly says, no, it's over, it's good. As we said, that's only one opinion. And if you are going to insist that what's happening over here between the debtor and the creditor is that the debtor has a personal responsibility that he has to discharge by paying back this money, even if you were to argue, okay, so the responsibility he has is only rabbinic, still zechiv mamash. It would be 100% responsibility, even if it's derabbanan. So it would be completely inappropriate to say the Chachamim are proud of him for doing it. You don't say that about somebody's doing what they're supposed to. We don't tell you we're proud of you because you stopped at the red light. When do you get nachas from the way a person behaves? When they went beyond what they were required to do, indicating that there is no personal responsibility on this borrower to repay the lender, even if the lender has not made the official statement to say Meshamet Ani. So what do we learn from this? Two important things. Number one, that there is not afkata de malka when it comes to debt on Shemittah. The person who is owed the money has to consciously relinquish his rights to the money. Number two, the fact that there is a way for the debtor to still repay him is because of the nature of his assets having gone into debt, not because of his personal requirement to repay. Now that we understand that when it comes to the cancellation of debts on Shemittah, it is not an automatic spiritual thing that occurs, but it is a human decision, we can now refer that to Shemitah's Karkois because we said that they are compared. So logic would tell us that when a person has to relinquish the rights to their own produce in their own field during Shemitah, must be along the same lines. Because Shemitah must operate identically in the two main arenas where Shemitah has practical halachas. Relieving your rights or releasing your rights to debt, releasing your rights to produce. Especially because, as we already mentioned, the pasuk mentions them both in the same verse. As the Rambam quoted in Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Gabbai Mitzvahs Hasei de Shmitas Ksofim, when it comes to the positive mitzvah to release debt, there the Rambam says that Tosefta says it's referring to two types of Shemitah. We already saw this before. One of the types of Shemitah affects debts, one of the types of Shemitah affects produce. So therefore, when the Torah uses the word Zed Devar HaShemitah, it means it quite literally. Who mitzvah Shemitah? V'zeh, what we're about to say, that's Devar HaShemitah. That is the reality of Shemitah. V'hainu, sheyesh mitzvah lagavra lidaber v'zeh Devar HaShemitah. You want to know what Shemitah is? Devar HaShemitah. The person has to say something. Lafgir b'fi v'sasodeh. He has to actually say that he's relinquishing his rights to the produce of his fields. The only difference between Shemitah's Karka and Shemitah's Ksofim is that when it comes to cancelling debts, the mitzvah is specifically to let go of the debt and not to chase and request that the person repay. So the scope of the Shemitah's Ksofim is that the creditor mustn't go looking for the debt. But as we said before, the assets that are owed to that creditor are technically still partially his. Whereas when you're talking about letting go of the produce of the field, where the Torah says, just let go of your field, there is no connection back to the owner of the field. The produce of his field is 100% fair game for whoever comes along and helps themselves. So now that we've gotten our perspective from understanding the cancellation of debt, and we've explained that when a person returns a debt during Shemittah, which they don't have to, that gives tremendous nachas to the Chachamim. So in addition to the fact that it's helped us to clarify the halachic parameters of Shemitah's karka, we're also going to use it to understand more of what the Mishnah said subsequently. We can understand the conclusion of Masechah Shvis, which is the Mishnah that follows. If a person borrows money from a convert and his children have previously not been Jewish and they also converted, if that ger passes away, the debtor does not have an obligation to return the debt to his heirs. But if he does, the Chachamim will be pleased. Then, the appropriate way to acquire any movable item is by physically moving it from one place to the next, and not verbally. So in other words, if you just say verbally that this is sold, even if you paid money for it, it's not yet good enough. Still says the Mishnah, yet if a person makes a verbal commitment and they follow it through, so yes, you're right, it is yours because I said it's yours, the Chachamim are pleased with that. So we've got to understand what the link is between these three conversations about paying back a debt in Shemitah, which gives the Chachamim nachas, and paying back a debt to the heirs of a ger, and keeping one's word in terms of a sale or a gift or whatever it might be. So what's the link between the two latter sections of the Mishnah, the first one which we were dealing with, which was about cancellation of debts? You can't just say it's because they all have the common phrase that the Chachamim are pleased. That's not enough of a link. There must be a common theme as to why the Chachamim are especially pleased with these behaviors. We don't just group things together because we have the same kind of language that we could use about them. There's got to be a thematic connection. So we've already established when it comes to repaying a loan Shemitah time, it's not a personal responsibility anymore. Shemitah has come, the debtor's responsibility is absolved. It's just that the item, the money, the asset has this link back to the creditor, and it's still considered a debt. So if the person now decides that he's going to give the debt back, he hasn't fulfilled a personal obligation because there wasn't one, but he's made the Chachamim happy because he's recognized that this asset actually really does have the definition of being a debt. That same principle applies equally also to the last two segments of the Mishnah. The person who borrowed money from a ger and then the ger passed away has no personal obligation to the ger's descendants if they were born before the conversion. Likewise, if somebody made a verbal undertaking that they were going to sell something or give something to an individual, they actually have no personal responsibility to them. And the only thing is he has an item that was now caught up in a particular responsibility because of a particular series of actions. That's why it's the same theme. The Chachamim will be pleased when people recognize that, look, we enmeshed this particular asset in this particular relationship, so it's appropriate to pass it on to those who are on the other side who deserve it. We could take it a step further than that. The Mishnah works in a progressive sense. Each story is more surprising than the preceding story. Generally, when the Mishnah gives various examples of a similar theme, it's because each one is more of a chiddush, is more insightful than the preceding one. So Tzorech Loimer would have to say that must be the order in which these three segments of the Mishnah were presented over here as well. שבכל אחת מהבובס או האחרונס יש חידוש בין ירוך החכמים נויכם מנו, על פי הבובס הקדמס לו. It must be that in each one of these three sections, the degree to which the Chachamim are impressed with the person will increase. Now, to get ourselves to that point, we're going to first point out something in the Mishnah that, when you notice it, is an important nuance. Let's look at the second case, which is the person who borrowed money from a ger. The ger passed away, and now he's not required to repay the children of the ger because they're not technically family, because they're all converted together. So, why did the Mishnah have to say, don't return it to the sons? Had the Mishnah only said, should somebody have borrowed from a person who converted together with his children and then he passed away, the Chachamim would be pleased if he returned that debt, we'd automatically know that obviously then you didn't have to. So why does the Mishnah say you don't have to do it? And if you do it, the Chachamim are impressed. We could have worked that out. Likewise, in the final section of that Mishnah, it says, the appropriate way for any person to acquire a movable object is by moving it. And yet, if a person didn't actually do the action, but they upheld their verbal commitment, then the Chachamim are pleased with them. So there too, any movement doesn't seem to make sense. Kakushas and Mefarshim, as many of the commentators point out, surely the goal of the Mishnah at that point is to tell you how great it is when a person keeps their word. This is Mishnah Shavias. And this particular Mishnah it's not the place where we're talking about how transactions happen. What this Mishnah wants to say is, look at that. When a person keeps their word, big deal. And by the same token, it's not only when it comes to acquiring objects that a person could keep their word. There are millions of cases where a person could keep their words. So why did the Mishnah first have to tell us that the correct way to acquire an item is by moving it, and then tell us, but if you keep your verbal commitment, great. Just tell us straight. If a person keeps their word, the Chachamim are pleased. The explanation is this. What do we mean when we say that the Chachamim are pleased with somebody? It means it means that the Chachamim love this individual for the way he's behaved, and his behavior is good in their eyes. Now that can't just be because they did something that's kind of a sidebar, valuable, nice thing that they did. Or they avoided some sidebar prohibition that they might have done. Even something he wasn't required to do, like giving the item back to the ger, to the heirs to the ger. The Chachamim would be pleased with the way a person behaves if the core of that behavior is impressive. Meaning this. Let's look at our case. We're talking about debts. Why are the Chachamim pleased with the person who goes to repay his debt when it's already Shemittah? What did he do? He did something good. Something he didn't have to do. Where is the value? In the debt itself. It's not like he did some nice, okay, listen, I'm not going to pay you the debt, but I'll buy you a coffee. Okay, so maybe the Chachamim would be happy that he's trying to placate the guy for the fact that he's not required to pay. No, he's paying the debt back. Now, when it comes to any interaction, specifically a financial interaction, like in this case a loan, there are three components. Aleph HaMalveh, there's the creditor. Beis HaLoiveh, there's the debtor. And there's the money, which is at play. It's the money that creates the bond and relationship between the lender and the borrower. So when a person returns their debt, despite the fact that Shemittah made it technically unnecessary, the Chachamim have nachas from all three perspectives. When you look at it from the perspective of the creditor who accepts this person's wish. I want to pay you back. He accepts it. Kemishos mitzvah. He, in order to have reached this point, did a mitzvah. How did this happen in the first place? Kesef ta'alveh. He obviously went out to lend somebody money. That's a good thing. That's a mitzvah. Ruach Chachamim noichem izeh. People have, the Chachamim have nachas from that. He has a yid who was helping another yid. And why do we have extra nachas? The best reason that we're happy is the malveh who did a mitzvah doesn't land up losing out financially because of it. He gets his money back. We're happy for him. With regards to the borrower, because the malveh was the source of his help, like the expression in the Gemara, don't throw a stone into the well that you drank from. So the loive got something beneficial from the malveh. So there the Chachamim are pleased to see they are pleased to see that the loive feels a debt of gratitude. He's got to pay back. Doesn't matter that I don't have to. I have to. And besides, the practical value in this for the borrower, that he'd be able to borrow again because he won't have a bad credit score. So there's value to the malveh and there's value to the loive. And then when you analyze the actual item itself, the money, because as we described before, technically this money is under the banner of debt. Even at the time when the debtor is no longer required to pay it. So obviously the Chachamim are going to be pleased that that choiv that still exists has been settled. The second example, is person who borrowed from a convert who converted together with his children. He doesn't have to return the debt to those heirs. But if he did, the Chachamim are happy. Why? Again, the Chachamim are not happy just because some side issue happened. Oh, this guy had felt bad for the heirs, so he decided to give them money. And he was worried that maybe if he didn't give them the money back, maybe they'd say, what was the point of becoming Jewish? The community doesn't care about us. So he wanted to facilitate that they'd still feel good about the Jewish identity. Actually, the value lies in the nature of the debt. But in this case, only 2 out of the 3 aspects. The only 2 who stand to benefit or give the Chachamim pleasure, nachas, is the borrower and the money. Because the borrower received benefit from the ger, and he borrowed money with intention to return it. Now, once the ger passes away, he has no requirement to repay the loan because there's nobody to repay it to. Still, the fact is, when he took that money, in his mind, it was clear that the purpose of this money was in order to return it. The fact is, this money, how did it land up in his possession? As a debt. So it would be appropriate to give it back. So he would discharge that original undertaking that he made to pay back the money. Good for him. Not good for the malveh. The malveh is not in the picture anymore. He passed away. And now, in a similar vein, the money itself benefits. The reality is you can't call this a debt because there's nobody around who it's still owing to. The person who it was owing to is no longer here. But as we already said before, this money was brushed with the color of debt. So the fact that this money doesn't really belong to the borrower, what changed that? And so therefore, for the benefit of the money itself, it should be returned. Now, the only potential destination of where to return the money is to the converts' children, so that they shouldn't feel that's a chilul Hashem, that since we became Jewish, they don't care for us and they don't pay us back. So therefore, so that's who he'll give the money back to, and that's what makes the Chachamim happy. But there you can't include the third component, the lender. There's no positive on behalf of the malveh, because he's passed away. And there is no scenario of a ger who passes away. In fact, there's no scenario ever of a person who passes away who becomes the lender. But certainly not in this case, because they're not even his true heirs. That's why we understand why the Mishnah specifically added Lo yachzir levanav, don't give the money to the children. Even though it's self-evident from the fact that should he have returned the money, all he gets is a pat on the back from the rabbis, not the fulfillment of a mitzvah. Why do they still say don't give the money to the children? Because the Mishnah wants to emphasize that there is nothing that could link that borrower to those children. Not only technically according to halacha, because you could say technically, halachically, they do not now replace the lender and become creditors, and therefore he doesn't owe them anything. The truth is, he doesn't even have a proper relationship or connection with them, even from the perspective of what will happen afterwards, that the Chachamim will be impressed that he paid them back. Now we can see how the Mishnah progresses from the story of the person who will return a debt even when it's Shemittah, and then not only that, but you'll even have a case of a person who will return a debt to people who are not technically the heirs of the creditor who died, but it's an increasingly impressive story. The idea of the Chachamim being happy with somebody does not only work when all three facets of the particular case are addressed in the person's actions. Like a person who, the first case, right? He's satisfying the malveh and is taking care of his responsibilities as a loive, and he's taking care of the choiv. The chiddush of the Mishnah at that point is that the Chachamim will be pleased with a person whose actions only affect 2 areas of the potential 3 areas of connection. Even that is valuable. What's the last one? The Mishnah says every movable object should be acquired by moving it. But anybody who keeps their word even before an action was taken, the Chachamim are pleased with that. Now, this is not so simple. It's not just that there's a sidebar issue. There was a transaction that was supposed to take place. Oh, and by the way, it's a good thing to keep your word. That's why we're happy with you, because you give me your word. The chiddush of this part of the Mishnah is to tell you there's something about the actual item that was on sale that is settled here, and that's what makes the Chachamim happy. This should have been sold, and now it's being given to the person, even though it was only a verbal commitment, and that gives the Chachamim nachas. But the truth is, there's nothing about this that satisfies a responsibility of either the seller or of the buyer. The buyer did not move the object as he was supposed to in order to show that he's taking ownership. Even if he gave money, there is no responsibility yet from the seller to actually part with his asset. There's nothing yet that has created a relationship of buyer and seller until that object is moved. More than that. When this person keeps his word, that doesn't ensure that something will be to the benefit of either buyer or seller. Let's say that the person didn't keep his word. The customer may not lose anything, because even if he did pay him, he'll get his money back. Doesn't really lose. He'll be disappointed, but he doesn't lose. The only issue at hand over here is the object should have been sold and it wasn't. Because what happens is the minute the conversation occurs, now there is some linkage between this item and that buyer. Much more so, of course, if he gives money, then there's definitely a connection between that item and the buyer. That's what the Mishnah wants us to know. Even in this scenario, where there really is no benefit to the buyer, there's no benefit to the seller. The only issue is that there's an item that was allocated for a particular cause, and now we're seeing it through. Where there's only one issue that's going to be resolved by this person fulfilling his verbal commitment. Ruach chachamim noichem imenu. That is something that makes the chachamim happy. Now, now that we have built our entire conversation around the nature of cancelling debt during the Shemittah, it's important to note that it does appear to be a self-contradictory element to cancellation of debts during Shemittah. Because Michad Gis on the one end, who, as we've discussed, what is the nature of relinquishing debt during Shemittah? Stepping back, I have no claim. So that's like a lack, a vacuum, a negative in a sense. And that's why if a person does still pay back the money, that's amazing. It's something that the Chachamim are already happy about because there was nothing there demanding from them. You'll see a similar thing with the nature of relinquishing the produce of our fields. All of those psukim indicate one thing: the land should not be worked. Shlila, stepping back, passive. On the other hand, yet, you see that's interesting? In order for that stepping back to occur, a person has to do something proactive, they have to say something. You've got to say words. He has to say, I excuse you from the debt. As we pointed out, right? It's got to be verbal. There's even an opinion that says that to say those words, that we cancel debt, is the requirement, the mitzvah midaraisa. The Mishnah actually builds on this concept of saying what needs to be said when a person is relinquishing their rights. So the Mishnah says, if a person was unfortunately killed somebody by accident, and he has to go to the Miklat. So the people they wanted to give him honor, he should say, don't give me honor, I'm a murderer. And if they say, we don't care, we still want to give you honor anyway. Same thing the Mishnah says. They accept, he has to accept their argument, because their dvar depends on what they say. And that's where he's warning them not to have a mistaken identity and to give him honor where he doesn't deserve it. Like the Yerushalmi explains. Like the Yerushalmi says, imagine, people want to give somebody honor because they imagine that he knows 2 Masechtas of Gemara, and he only knows one, he has to tell them. So what do we see? This fascinating element of Shemittah, that the construct of Shemittah, as much as it is about what we don't do, we don't work, we don't take the product of our fields, we don't collect debts, all of it is defined by what we say. Debt is forgiven. And this really makes sense most beautifully when you look at it through the lens of Chassidus. In Yonoshel Shnasa Shvi Sferas HaMalchus, the Tzemach Tzedek explains that Shemittah relates to Sferas HaMalchus. Sheshnei Inyonim Elu Ba Sferas HaMalchus has both of these 2 elements that we've just described. What's not happening, the passive relinquishing of control, and speech. Sfiras HaMalchus yesh lo bo bitul legabe ha-sfira shel hamayla mimeno. Sfiras HaMalchus relinquishes self. It's got absolute bitul to the highest spheres that precede it. Or Sfiras HaMalchus olam ha'dibur, and as we well know, Sfiras HaMalchus is the realm of speech. That's why the seventh year that relates to the seventh midah, which is the midah of Malchus, has these two elements. It's on the one hand, quiet. Nobody's working. A bit of ashvisa ba'aretz, letting go of control. Bittul, the land must lie fallow. Malchus, like Malchus, which has nothing of its own. Don't get involved. Don't be proactive. Don't plant a field. Don't collect your debts. And at the same time, there's a mitzvah to say the words Devar Hashmita, because that's the nature of Malchus. Now we can go back to that medrash. What is the definition of those people who have the guts to keep Shemittah even when they see their own things being taken by other people? Dvar. They always say Devoroi, they do his word, they listen to his words. We don't use the more common types of expressions that they do what Hashem instructs. Because Shemittah is specifically related to speech. And as the Medrash proves, how do we know that pasuk is specifically talking about farmers during the Shemittah? Because Ne'emar kan say devaroi, and Ne'emar alon bezed devar hashmita. It links the word specifically devaroi. Just like the word davar in the pasuk v'zed devar hashmita is talking about people that keep Shemittah, so too likewise, oisei dvarei shemer b'kol dvarei must be talking about people who keep Shemittah. Now we can understand why the conclusion of the entire Masechta Shvius is anybody who keeps their word, the Chachamim are pleased. Why? Because it's talking about Shvius, and Shvius is the power of words. Therefore, when we learn about the laws of Shvius, the Gemara tells us whenever you engage verbally and in the study of a particular set of halachas, it's as if you fulfill them. That will hasten time, like it says in Tilim, that Eibishter will want our land, and the Mefarshim say that means will fulfill Shemittah. Shavta Shvis Yaakov, the return of the captives of Yaakov, Asavas Shavyasa Deves Yaakov, the captives of Yaakov will come home. As the pasuk continues, Hashem will give us good and great yield of the harvests in Israel. And we as the Jewish people will be powerful, will have the gumption to be able to stand up for what Hashem expects of us. Shoimrei Shavias will be those who uphold and keep the Shemitah. We'll be able to keep Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael, and not just as a derabanan, but min ha-Torah, because of mamish, and that should happen speedily. When the Eibishter fulfills his commitment. Devar Havaya Zeh the Eibishter's word is the end of Galus. And then the Eibishter will be the king of the whole world, with the coming of Mashiach, who will lead us speedily back to our land, to Eretz Yisrael.